The dust was a living thing, a fine red powder that coated Elias Thorne's tongue and settled in the creases of his sun-scorched neck. It rose from a landscape of relentless horizons, where the sky was a pale, unforgiving blue and the earth offered nothing but sagebrush and stone. For 3 years, this land had taken from him. It took the flesh from his bones, the hope from his heart, and finally, it had taken his wife, Martha, leaving a silence in his cabin more profound than any winter storm. Now he was waiting. The twice-monthly stagecoach was a smudge of motion in the distance, a crawling beetle that carried his last desperate bid for survival, an answer to his letter. He had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, his words blunt and stripped of romance, a transaction of needs. Widower, 38, sober and hard-working. Own 300 acres, modest cabin, some stock. Require a wife. Practical, strong, willing to work. A widow preferred. One who understands loss and the hardship of this life. He had enclosed nearly all his savings. The reply had been swift. A Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a widow from Ohio, had agreed. She was, the letter assured him, a woman of good character and sturdy constitution. Her photograph showed a plain, solemn face, but her eyes held a familiar weariness that felt more honest than any smile. She was his last chance. Without a partner, the ranch would swallow him whole by spring. The loneliness was a physical ache, a phantom limb where his life used to be. The coach rattled into the dusty street of Redemption, a town that offered little of its namesake. Elias stood apart from the few onlookers, his hands clenched. The driver, a burly man named Silas, swung down and spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Got a delivery for you, Thorne," he grunted, his eyes holding a glint of something cruel. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He scanned the coach's interior, expecting the solemn face from the photograph. Instead, the door was thrown open and a woman was nudged, almost pushed, out into the harsh light. She stumbled, catching herself on the hitching post. She was small, delicate as a bird, and she was Chinese. Her face was a mask of terror, her dark eyes wide and lost. She wore a silk dress the color of a faded plum, finely made but stained and travel-worn, a garment utterly alien to this place of canvas and wool. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, a mix of shock and derision. "What is this?" Elias's voice was a low growl. Silas shrugged, unlatching a small, battered trunk and dropping it in the dust. "Change of plans. Your Mrs. Vance took ill in Cheyenne. Sold her ticket. This one's contract was acquired by the agency. All paid for." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper laced with contempt. "Got her out of a place in San Francisco. You know the kind. She don't speak a lick of English, but I reckon you ain't paying her to talk." He laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The woman flinched at the laughter, her gaze darting from the hostile faces back to the coach, as if willing it to take her back. But the driver was already climbing aboard, the horses stamping with impatience. The world narrowed to the dust, the mocking sun, and the terrified woman standing before him. This was not the sturdy widow who understood hardship. This was a fragile, broken thing from a world he could not comprehend. This was not an answer to a prayer. It was a curse. Her name was May, though no one here knew it. The name was a secret she held behind her teeth, a smooth, round stone she could press her tongue against when the fear became too much. Fear was all she had known for a year. It was the smell of stale opium and cheap perfume in the San Francisco brothel. It was the weight of men who took what they wanted and left their shame behind on her skin. It was the sharp, metallic taste of a lie when she was told she was being sent to a respectable family as a maid. The lie had unraveled with every mile eastward, with every callous glance from the stagecoach driver who looked at her as if she were livestock. Now the lie was gone completely, leaving only this terrifying emptiness. The man before her was huge, a mountain of denim and dust. His face was hard, carved from the same unforgiving rock as the land around him. She saw the shock in his eyes curdle into something colder, something that looked like disgust. She had seen that look before. It was the look men gave you when they were done with you. She braced herself for the blow, for the shove back toward the town where other men were already staring, their eyes hungry and cruel. She would not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency that bought only more pain. He did not strike her. He simply stood there, frozen, while the stagecoach that had been her prison for weeks became a speck of dust, abandoning her. The man, Thorne, the driver had called him, finally moved. He let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a dying animal. He looked at her, then at her small trunk in the dirt, then at the vast, empty land that stretched out in every direction. He seemed to see the cage she was in, a cage made of open space. He spoke, his voice rough. The words were meaningless sounds, but the tone was one of utter despair. He gestured with a sharp, angry motion toward a wagon hitched nearby. It was not a question. It was a command. She picked up her trunk, the weight of her entire world contained in the worn wooden box, and walked toward the wagon on trembling legs. The townspeople watched her, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. She felt their judgment as a physical force, a brand pressed upon her. Whore, foreigner, thing. She climbed onto the wagon seat, keeping her back straight, her gaze fixed on her own hands, folded tightly in her lap. The man loaded her trunk and climbed up beside her. The space between them was a chasm of silence and misunderstanding. As the wagon lurched forward, leaving the town behind, May stared at the horizon. The landscape was brutal, beautiful, and terrifyingly vast. It was a place where a person could disappear without a trace. Perhaps, she thought with a strange, hollow calm, that was what was meant to happen to her. She was a ghost already, haunting a life that was no longer her own. The journey to the ranch was made in a silence so thick it felt like another passenger on the wagon seat. Elias did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the rutted track, his jaw set like granite. May watched him from the corner of her eye, studying the hard line of his profile, the tension in his powerful shoulders. He was a man locked in a battle with his own disappointment, and she was the cause of it. She understood. She was a disappointment to herself. The cabin, when they reached it, was more of a shack. It was a low, dark shape against the bruised twilight, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A single window glowed with a faint, lonely light from the dying embers in the hearth. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile thread of life in the immense wilderness. It was a place of profound solitude, a place that could either shelter you or crush you. He brought her inside. The single room was stark and clean, but achingly empty. A large bed stood in one corner, a rough table and 2 chairs in the center, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall. A smaller, curtained-off alcove held a narrow cot. He pointed to it. "There," he said. The word was clipped, devoid of warmth. It was her space, cot in a corner. It was more than she'd had in a year. He moved with a weary economy, stoking the fire until it crackled back to life, filling a pot with water from a bucket by the door. He set it on a hook over the flames. He moved as if she were not there, a ghost in her own new life. May stood by the door, her trunk at her feet, feeling as out of place as her silk dress. The heat from the fire began to push back the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She watched him slice bread from a loaf and cut pieces of dried meat onto 2 tin plates. He set them on the table, then looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of his knife against the plate. The bread was coarse, the meat salty and tough, but it was the first food she had been offered that was not simply thrown at her. When he was finished, he stood and took a blanket from the foot of his large bed. He tossed it onto her cot. It was a gesture of finality. He expected nothing from her, and he would offer nothing more than this barest of shelter. He turned his back to her, removed his boots, and lay down on his own bed, facing the wall. Soon, the sound of his steady breathing filled the small cabin. May did not move for a long time. She sat at the table, the firelight dancing on her face, and listened to the wind as it moaned around the corners of the cabin. It sounded like a lonely spirit, searching for something it had lost. She was a stranger in a strange man's house, in a land that did not want her. She did not know his rules. She did not know his language. She only knew the universal language of survival. She rose silently, took the plates from the table, and carried them to a wash basin. Using water from the bucket, she washed them, her movements small and quiet. She dried them with a piece of cloth and set them back on the table, exactly where they had been. She looked around the room, at the worn broom in the corner, the dust motes dancing in the firelight, the stark order of a life lived alone. This was her new reality. A cot, a blanket, and a man whose back was turned against her. She retreated to her alcove, pulling the thin curtain closed. It was a flimsy barrier, offering no real privacy, but it was hers. She did not undress. She lay on the cot, pulling the rough wool blanket over her, and stared into the darkness. She was no longer May. She was a creature of silence, a shadow in a lonely man's home, and she would survive. She had to. Dawn broke not with softness, but with a blade of pale light that sliced across the dusty floor. May was awake long before it, her body accustomed to rising in the pre-dawn chill of the city. She had slept in fits, startled by the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. The cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of some small creature beneath the floorboards. The man, Elias, was still asleep, a large, still form under his own blankets. Quietly, she slipped from her cot and went outside. The air was bitingly cold, clean, and sharp. It smelled of pine and damp earth. The world was painted in shades of gray and deep violet, the stars still clinging to a fading sky. She saw the source of the cabin's water, a hand pump over a well several yards away. A chore. Everything here was a chore. A relentless cycle of work needed to keep the encroaching wilderness at bay. She returned inside, her mind working. She could not speak to him. She could not explain who she was or how she had come to be here. Words were a luxury she did not have. Her only language now was action. Her survival depended on her utility. She found the broom and began to sweep the floor, her movements measured and efficient, gathering the red dust that seemed to seep in through the very walls. She wiped down the table, straightened the two chairs. She found a pile of his mending in a basket, a shirt with a torn sleeve, socks worn thin at the heel. She took out a small sewing kit from her trunk, one of the few possessions she truly owned, and sat in the growing light, her needle flashing. When Elias woke, it was to the smell of wood smoke and the sight of her, sitting by the hearth, stitching his worn shirt with tiny, perfect stitches. The cabin was cleaner, more orderly than he had left it. A pot of water was already heating over the fire. He sat up, running a hand through his tangled hair, his expression unreadable. He watched her for a long moment. She did not look up, her focus entirely on her work. She was like a small, determined machine, creating order from the quiet chaos of his life. He grunted, a sound that was neither kind nor unkind, and pulled on his boots. He went outside, and she heard the rhythmic squeak and splash of the water pump. He returned with 2 full buckets, setting them by the hearth without a word. He then took a sack of oats and measured some into a pot, adding water and setting it to cook for their breakfast. The routine was established without a single word being exchanged. He provided the raw materials, the water, the food, the shelter. She, in turn, began to transform them. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She moved through the small space with a quiet grace that was at odds with the harshness of their surroundings. She learned the geography of his exhaustion, the way he slumped into a chair at the end of the day, his hands raw and calloused. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, the pre-dawn milking of the single cow, the feeding of the chickens, the endless work of fence mending and chopping wood that he undertook from sunup to sundown. One afternoon, she ventured out, exploring the small perimeter around the cabin. Behind the shack, she found a neglected patch of earth where withered stalks of beans and squash lay testament to a past effort. Martha's garden. The thought came to him as he watched her from the barn. his hands still on a broken harness. He saw her kneel, crumbling the dry soil between her fingers, her expression thoughtful. He expected her to give up, to come back inside where it was warm. Instead, she found a rusty spade and began to turn the soil, clearing the dead plants, her small frame straining with the effort. He felt a strange, unwelcome pang in his chest. It was not pity. It was something more complicated. He had bought a wife, a partner. He had received a silent, foreign girl who seemed more like a ghost than a person. But the ghost was clearing his dead wife's garden. Weeks bled into a month. The silence between them remained, but it changed its character. It was no longer the sharp, brittle silence of anger and fear. It began to soften, to become a shared space rather than a dividing wall. Elias found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a kind of grudging wonder. She was tireless. The garden, which he had abandoned after Martha's death, was now cleared and tidy. The soil turned and ready for a planting he knew was impossible before the last frost. She had found seeds in a tin box in the pantry, Martha's seeds, and had laid them out on a cloth to inspect them. She had washed their clothes in a large tub with soap she made from lye and animal fat, a skill he hadn't known existed. The cabin was not just clean. It felt different. It was cared for. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the small cabin to its foundations. Rain fell in solid, deafening sheets. Elias was mending a bridle by the fire when a particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the windowpane. He saw her flinch, her hands pausing in her work of grinding corn into meal. Her face was pale in the firelight, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go beyond the storm. It was an old fear, a memory of a different kind of violence. He felt an unfamiliar impulse to offer comfort, but he had no words for it. Instead, he rose and walked to the window, peering out into the maelstrom. "Just a squall," he said, more to himself than to her. "It'll pass." She, of course, did not understand his words, but she seemed to understand the calm in his voice. She watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped the stone pestle. He turned from the window and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not the terrified girl from the stagecoach, but a woman who had weathered storms far worse than this. He picked up a log and placed it carefully on the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The simple, domestic act was a shield against the chaos outside. He sat down again, and after a moment, the rhythmic grinding of the corn started once more, a small, steady sound of persistence against the roar of the storm. The next day, he returned from his work to find a small, woven mat by the door for wiping the mud from his boots. It was made from reeds she had gathered by the creek. It was a simple thing, yet it spoke of a thought for his comfort, for the cleanliness of their shared space. That evening, as she was banking the fire for the night, he placed something on the table without a word. It was a small block of wood, and on it, he had carved a crude but recognizable bird, a sparrow. He had seen her watching them as they flitted around the barn. May stared at the carving. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the rough lines of the wings, the tiny head. It was a gift, a communication. It was the first beautiful thing she had been given in a lifetime. She looked up at him, and for the first time, her eyes were not filled with fear or blankness. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the person hidden beneath the layers of hardship. Elias felt his own lips twitch in response. He gave a short, awkward nod, then turned away, unnerved by the sudden warmth in his chest. He had wanted a practical, sturdy wife. He had been given a silent stranger. But he was beginning to realize that strength came in forms he had never considered. The town of redemption was a place Elias had always avoided unless absolutely necessary. It was a place of gossip, judgment, and men whose idleness bred a particular kind of cruelty. His monthly trip for supplies was an ordeal he endured, not enjoyed. This time it was different. This time the town was waiting for him. As he hitched his wagon outside the general store, he could feel their eyes on him. The whispers followed him inside. That's him. The one who bought the Chinawoman, the storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy. A man whose piety was as thin as his hair, regarded him with a sanctimonious pity. Thorn. Heard you had some trouble with your arrangement. I need flour, salt, and coffee, Elias said, his voice flat, cutting off the inquiry. As Abernathy measured out the flour, a man named Jedediah Cole pushed his way to the counter. Cole was a rancher whose property bordered Elias's, a swaggering bully who had always regarded Elias's hard work with contempt. Heard you got yourself some exotic livestock, Thorn, Cole said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. His two hired hands snickered behind him. Elias ignored him, placing his coins on the counter. Heard she was from one of them houses in Frisco, Cole pressed, stepping closer. Must be well trained. I'd be willing to take her off your hands. A man like you has no use for such a delicate thing. I pay you a fair price. More than you paid. I'd wager the air in the store went still. Elias slowly turned, his eyes cold as river stones. She is not for sale. Oh, not for sale? Cole mocked. Don't tell me you're getting fond of it. Everyone knows what they are. You can't make a wife out of a creature like that. The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Elias's hand, resting on a sack of flour, clenched into a fist. He could feel the rage, hot and potent, rising in his throat. He wanted to smash Cole's leering face, to silence the vile words. But he knew it would solve nothing. It would only bring more trouble, trouble that would inevitably fall upon May. He forced himself to unclench his fist. He looked Cole directly in the eye, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of my way, Cole, for a moment. Cole seemed ready to escalate, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. But something in Elias's gaze, a promise of absolute, devastating violence, made him hesitate. With a sneer, Cole stepped back. You'll regret this, Thorn, keeping that thing on your land. It'll bring a curse down on you. Elias gathered his supplies, his movements stiff. He walked out of the store, the silence of the onlookers pressing in on him. He knew Cole was right about one thing. It wasn't May who was the curse. It was the town. It was the poison of men like Cole. As he drove the wagon home, the anger did not fade. It settled into a hard, protective knot in his gut. They saw her as a thing, a piece of property to be bartered and used. They didn't see the way her hands, though small, could coax life from dead soil. They didn't see the quiet dignity with which she moved, the resilience in her eyes. They didn't see the person she was. He had been guilty of it, too, at first. He had seen only a problem, a broken contract. He had not seen her. The wagon crested the final rise, and he saw the cabin, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. A light glowed in the window. It was no longer just his cabin. It was a home, and he would protect it. He would protect her. The first snow fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a flurry of sharp, angry flakes driven by a biting wind. It was a warning of the winter to come, a season that did not forgive weakness. The cold seeped into the cabin, and May felt it as a familiar enemy. She worked to fortify their small fortress against it. She used strips of leftover cloth, dipped in tallow, to seal the cracks around the window frame and the door. She braided the husks from the corn into thick, insulating mats to place against the coldest wall. Elias watched her, impressed by her ingenuity. He had always fought the winter with brute force. More wood, more work. She fought it with intelligence, with a careful attention to detail he lacked. One afternoon, he came in from the barn, his face raw from the wind, to find her shivering by the fire, her hands tucked into her sleeves. Her silk dress, the only one she owned, was thin and offered little protection. Her shoes were worn through. He looked at her, then at the heavy winter coat and boots that had belonged to Martha, stored in a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He had not opened that chest since she died. It was a tomb of memories he could not bear to face. He hesitated, the grief a physical weight in his chest. But the sight of May, small and trembling in the encroaching cold, was a more immediate pain. He walked to the chest and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old wool rose to meet him. He pulled out the coat, a heavy thing of dark wool lined with fleece, and a pair of sturdy leather boots. He carried them to her, his movements stiff. He held them out. May looked from the clothes to his face, her expression confused. She recognized them as women's clothes, but she did not understand. He gestured toward her, then toward the coat, mimicking the act of putting it on. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flicker of fear. She shook her head, backing away slightly. She would not take a dead woman's clothes. It was bad luck, a violation. She could not fill that space. Elias saw the refusal, the fear. He didn't understand the reason, but he understood the sentiment. He had felt it himself. He set the clothes down on a chair, not forcing the issue. He couldn't make her wear them. But the cold was not a thing that could be reasoned with. That night, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and ice formed on the inside of the windowpane. May, huddled on her cot under her single thin blanket, could not stop shaking. The cold was a physical thing, stealing the breath from her lungs. In the deepest part of the night, she heard movement. Elias rose from his bed. She saw his silhouette against the dying glow of the fire. He came to her alcove and, without a word, laid his own heavy blankets over her. He took her thin one and went back to his bed. The warmth was immediate, a profound relief that sank deep into her bones. It smelled of him, of wood smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the outdoors. It was an act of pure, selfless protection. She lay under the weight of his blankets, listening to the storm outside, and felt a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. He had given her his warmth. He had taken the cold for himself. She fell asleep not just warmed, but safe. The next morning, when he went out to tend to the animals, she walked to the chair where Martha's coat and boots lay. She touched the wool, soft and thick. She thought of the man sleeping under a single thin blanket in the freezing dark. Slowly, deliberately, she took off her worn silk dress and put on the dead woman's clothes. The coat was too big, the boots a little loose, but they were warm. They were a shield. When Elias returned, he saw her standing by the fire, wearing Martha's coat. She looked small inside it, but she was no longer shivering. She met his gaze, and in her eyes was a silent acknowledgement. "Thank you." He simply nodded, a tightness in his throat. A boundary had been crossed. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were two people fighting the same winter together. The winter tightened its grip, burying the world in a deep, silent white. The days shortened, the work becoming a relentless battle against the cold. The isolation was absolute. For weeks, they saw no other human soul. The world shrank to the cabin, the barn, and the path between them. It was in this compressed world that their silent language became fluent. May learned the meaning of his different grunts. One for approval, one for frustration, one for simple acknowledgement. She could read the weariness in the slump of his shoulders, the worry in the tightness around his eyes when the snow was too deep and he feared for the livestock. Elias, in turn, learned to read her. He saw the quiet pride she took in a perfectly baked loaf of bread, the flicker of sorrow in her eyes when she looked at the single, faded photograph of two stern-faced people she kept wrapped in silk inside her trunk, her parents. He learned that the small, intricate knots she sometimes tied with a piece of string were a form of prayer or meditation, a way of centering herself when the silence grew too loud. One day, he found her in the barn, talking softly to the milk cow. The words were Chinese, a gentle, melodic flow of sound that was startling after so much silence. The cow stood placidly, chewing its cud, seeming to listen. He stood in the doorway unseen and just listened. He did not understand a single word, but he understood the loneliness that drove her to speak to an animal. He understood the need to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. That evening, he began a new ritual. After their meal, he took down a worn book from a high shelf. It was a book of poems Martha had loved. He opened it and began to read aloud. His voice was rough, unpracticed, but steady. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. and miles to go before I sleep." May sat across from him, her hands still. She did not understand the words, but she heard the cadence, the rhythm, the quiet emotion in his voice. It was not for her, not really. It was for him, a way to fill the crushing silence. But it was also a gift to her, a sharing of something from his world. From then on, he read every night. She would listen, her head bent over her mending, and the sound of his voice became a part of the fire's crackle and the wind's moan. A steady, human presence in the vast, empty wilderness. The fragile trust between them was tested when he fell ill. A deep, racking cough settled in his chest, and a fever left him shivering and weak. For 2 days he could not leave his bed. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped May. If he died, she would die. She would be alone, trapped by the snow with no way to survive. But another instinct, stronger than fear, took over. She nursed him with a fierce determination. She kept the fire roaring. She melted snow for water, forcing him to drink. She made thin, nourishing broths. She went out into the blinding snow to the barn, tending to the animals, her face wrapped in a scarf, Martha's big coat swallowing her whole. She used her knowledge of herbs, things she had learned from her grandmother long ago. She found willow bark by the frozen creek, boiling it into a bitter tea to fight the fever. She made a poultice of mustard and flour to place on his chest, the sharp heat helping to break the congestion. Elias, drifting in and out of fevered dreams, was dimly aware of her. He felt her cool hand on his forehead, heard her soft, foreign words of encouragement. He saw her small, determined form moving through the cabin, a bastion of strength against the encroaching darkness. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He woke, weak but clear-headed, to see her asleep in the chair by his bed, her head slumped forward in exhaustion. A half-empty bowl of broth sat on the table beside her. He looked at her, truly saw the toll the last few days had taken. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she looked even smaller, more fragile than before. But she had not broken. She had saved him. He had brought her here to be his helpmate, to ease his burden. Instead, she had become his lifeline. As the snow began to recede, revealing a landscape washed clean and new, the threat of the town returned. It came in the form of Jedediah Cole and 2 of his men, riding up to the ranch one crisp morning. Elias saw them coming from a distance and his body went rigid. He was chopping wood, the axe in his hand, suddenly feeling both a tool and a weapon. May was inside, but she saw the change in him through the window and her hands went still. Cole reined in his horse a few yards away, his expression a smug mask. "Thorn, winter's over. Thought I'd come by and renew my offer." His eyes slid past Elias, fixing on the cabin door. "I'm a generous man. $500. For the girl, Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're on my land, Cole. State your business or ride out." "That is my business," Cole sneered. "You can't keep her here. It ain't right. The folks in town are talking. They say you're livin' in sin with a heathen whore. It gives the whole valley a bad name." "What I do on my land is my concern," Elias said, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "She's not a thing to be bought and sold." Cole laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that carried on the clean air. "That's all she is, Thorn. That's all her kind has ever been. You're a fool if you think otherwise." He swung down from his horse, his men dismounting behind him, their hands resting near their pistols. "I'm not asking any more. We're here to collect what you're polluting this land with." Elias planted his feet. "You'll take her over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Cole said, pulling his pistol. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked was deafeningly loud. The cabin door creaked open. May stood there, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She held a cast-iron skillet, her only weapon. Cole's leer widened. "Look at that. The little kitten has claws." He took a step forward. But before he could take another, a movement from the barn caught his eye. A shape, large and brown, was hurtling toward them. It was the bull. The young bull Elias kept penned in the far corral. The gate was wide open. It charged not with blind rage, but with a focused fury, its head low, its horns aimed directly at the intruders. Cole's men yelled and scrambled for their horses. Cole himself stood frozen for a second in disbelief before diving out of the way as the bull thundered past, hooking a horn through the saddle of his horse. The animal screamed and bolted, dragging the saddle with it. The bull, its initial target gone, turned its attention to the other two men, who were already mounted and spurring their terrified horses into a panicked retreat. Cole, left on the ground, cursed and scrambled to his feet, firing a wild shot that went nowhere near the rampaging animal. He ran, clumsy and terrified, after his men, not daring to look back. Elias stood, stunned, the axe still in his hand. He looked at the open corral gate, then back at the cabin. May was no longer in the doorway. He ran to the back of the barn. He found her leaning against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. In her hand was the long iron pin that secured the corral gate. She had seen them coming. She had understood the threat. While they were focused on him, she had slipped out the back, circled around to the corral, and unleashed the one force on the ranch more dangerous than 3 armed men. She had not screamed or cried. She had acted. She had used the tools of this place, her knowledge of this place, to protect it. To protect him. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. She let the heavy pin drop to the ground with a thud. In the ringing silence that followed, Elias walked over to her. The air was still charged with the violence of the moment, the smell of gunpowder and panicked sweat. He looked down at the iron pin in the dirt, then at her. She stood trembling, her knuckles white where her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. He reached out, not with the roughness she might have expected, but with a gentleness that was entirely new. He took her hand. Her skin was cold. He saw a long, shallow scratch on her forearm where she must have scraped it against the rough wood of the corral. He said nothing. Words were useless, inadequate. He led her back toward the cabin, his grip on her hand firm and steady. Inside, he sat her down at the table, his movements deliberate. He went to the wash basin, wet a clean cloth, and came back to her. He knelt before her chair and began to gently clean the wound on her arm. She watched him, her breath still unsteady. His head was bent, his focus entirely on the small task. His large, calloused fingers, so capable of brute force, were now impossibly tender as they cleansed the scrape. It was an act of profound intimacy, more revealing than any touch they had shared. In that moment, she was not a contract, not a foreigner, not a whore. She was a person who had been hurt, and he was caring for her. When he was done, he did not immediately let go of her hand. He held it for a moment longer, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. In his gaze, she saw a universe of unspoken things. Gratitude, respect, and something deeper, something that looked like awe. He had seen her strength, and he was not afraid of it. He was humbled by it. That evening, a new quiet settled over the cabin. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of necessity. It was a silence of peace, of two people who had faced a threat together and survived. As he read by the firelight, his voice was softer than usual. May did not do her mending. She simply sat and watched the flames, listening to the cadence of his words, feeling the warmth of the fire and the steady presence of the man across from her. When it was time to sleep, she went to her cot in the alcove. But as she lay in the darkness, she knew something fundamental had shifted. The flimsy curtain no longer felt like the border between two separate worlds. It was just a piece of cloth in a single shared room. She thought of the life she had left, the life that had been stolen from her. It seemed like a distant nightmare, a story that had happened to someone else. The woman who had been pushed from the stagecoach, terrified and alone, was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the weight of an iron skillet, the heft of a corral pin, and the strength of her own will to survive. She had found a home not in a place, but in the quiet, resilient partnership she had forged with a lonely man in the middle of nowhere. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of hope. It was a small, fragile flame in the vast darkness, but it was there, and it was enough.